This is a 2001 Audi TT, which is one of the most beautiful cars from its time period. This car came out for the 2000 model year, 20 years ago, which is hard to believe because it still looks so good today. I've borrowed this TT from a viewer here in San Diego, and today I'm going to show you all of the quirks and features of the original Audi TT.
So guys, bago tayo magsimula, kung gusto mo pala yung mga ganitong klaseng content, mga detailing, or anything about sa sasakyan, please subscribe to my channel. Shoutout nga pala kay Kuya Mikmik. Kung gusto nyo dumami pang nalalaman nyo tungkol sa mga sasakyan, mag-subscribe lang kayo sa channel niya. Dami mong alam. Sigurado, dadami pa ang inyong nalalaman. So guys, ano pang hinihintay natin? Hugasan na natin tong TT na to.
But first, a little overview. Now, the original concept version of the TT was designed by Freeman Thomas, and that later morphed into a production version designed by Peter Schreier, who's been responsible for transforming Kia's designs from crap like this into more attractive cars like this in recent years. But for both designers, their best work was the original TT, which looked futuristic when it first came out, and which has won numerous awards for its design over the years. Now, I'm going to start the quirks and features with a look at the TT's design and some of the reasons why it was so influential. A lot of car designers and car magazines have called this one of the most influential designs of the last 20 years, and it always annoys me when people say a car design is influential and then they won't explain what exactly it influenced. So here are a few trends that the TT kind of started. One is the concealment of the bumpers in this car. If you look at most late 1990s cars, the bumpers were kind of ugly and protruding, and they were clearly there to be bumpers for crash safety. The TT was able to integrate the bumpers into the styling of the car and almost make it look like the car doesn't actually have bumpers. It was a really cool look that fit perfectly with the rounded design of this car, and it's one that almost every automaker copied in the ensuing years. Now, to me, one of the biggest trends that the TT started was wheel arches. If you look at a lot of late 90s cars, the wheel arches were often just integrated into the side of the car. They were just a functional piece and nobody did anything with them. That changed with the TT. You had the wheel arch, of course, but then they made a point to have it sort of larger than it needed to be and more protruding to kind of give a different effect than a typical wheel arch. And you can see the wheel arch even goes through the hood line right here. That trend is still being used in the car industry today. In fact, it was copied almost identically by the Range Rover Evoque when that car came out in 2013, almost 15 years after the TT first debuted. But anyway, those are most of the TT's influential design traits, and now I'll move on to the quirks and features, starting with the brake lights, which are actually kind of a cool design piece in themselves. Instead of having just an ugly red light stuck on the back of the car for regulatory purposes, it sort of fits into the rear hump of the car. It almost looks like just a panel, part of the styling that happens to have some lights in it. Next, while we're still around back in this car, I want to talk about the rear spoiler, which is actually rather interesting. Now, when this car first came out, Audi's designers wanted it to be nice and rounded in the front and rounded in the back, this nice, clean, classic, unbroken look of roundness. But there was a problem. Some early TTs were involved in high-speed accidents, and Audi thought it was because they weren't getting enough downforce in the back. The rear was lifting and making the cars unstable and unsafe at high speeds. So there was a voluntary recall. You could go in if you had an early TT, and you could get a rear spoiler installed to keep the car planted at really high speeds. Later TT models just came with the spoiler from the factory. Now, this car probably had the rear spoiler added as part of the recall. The owner of this car told me that the early TT models that never had the recall done and thus preserved their original rounded beauty are actually sought after in the TT community, and they're worth more than cars where the owners went in and had the spoiler put on. Of course, they might not be as stable at high speeds. Next up, still around back, another interesting quirk of the TT has to do with the exhausts. Now you can see that this car has dual exhausts, And that's because it is the 225 horsepower all-wheel drive model. There was also a base model with front-wheel drive and 180 horsepower, and those only had one exhaust. So if you're looking at an early first-generation TT before they added the V6 late in the model run, the easiest way to tell apart whether you're looking at the front-wheel drive one or the more powerful all-wheel drive one is by checking the exhausts.